So we know both world wars were just giant class wars that were fought due to the inequalities brought on by capitalism being introduced to Eastern Europe. Wait, we do know both world wars were class wars, right? Right? Of course, they were also a result of world superpowers playing tug of war, but what was it that sparked them to play tug of war? Do you know why World War II is taught to us like, so there was this random evil dude with a scary mustache who just went berserk for no reason, and he tried to eliminate every Yiddish speaker he could find. It's because that version of events serves an imperialist agenda from to. Yes, of course, Mustachio did target Yiddish speakers, but it's not just because he was targeting ethnic minorities. It's because the vast majority of the Jewish population in Eastern Europe at the time was overwhelmingly, unequivocally leftist. There's a reason communists were targeted by Mustachio as well. We're gonna have to go all the way back to the 1860s to start. Two major things happened in Eastern Europe at this time. One, capitalism was introduced, and these giant factories began to pop up that were demanding large, dirt-cheap manual labor forces. And two, Russia abolished serfdom under the reign of Tsar Alexander II. Now, as you can imagine, these factory jobs were horrific. We're talking 12 to 14-hour days, 6 to 7 days a week, just to earn 1.5 rubles, which comes to about 78 cents in today's dollar. So who on earth was flocking to these jobs? The former serfs, many of which were children, who now had to leave the agricultural communities most of them were born into to go into larger cities in order to find any work they could. And Jewish children ages 12 to 18. So most of the people working in these factories were children. And just like the former serf children, why were these Jewish children accepting these jobs? Because most of them were living in devastating, abject poverty in designated Jewish neighborhoods called shtetls. In Russia, all of these shtetls were within the borders of something called the Pale of Settlement. At the turn of the century, there were around 11 million Jews worldwide, and 5 million of these Jews were living within the Pale of Settlement. Many, if not all of these children, chose to work in these factories because they were all already living in total misery. So why not be miserable with a little bit of change in your pocket? But here is where the problems started. These groups of children led extremely different lives from one another outside of their jobs. And the main difference was literacy. Despite being dirt poor, almost all Jewish children could read and write in both Yiddish and Hebrew, because the center of life in any shtetl was its shul, or synagogue, which served not only as its house of prayer, but also as a house of study and a social center. However, these Jewish children almost exclusively learned traditional religious texts and religious philosophical arguments. Many of them were taught virtually no working skills or any sort of practical knowledge, which is yet another reason these Jewish children chose to work in these factories. They could actually learn a trade there. Of course, there are exceptions to every rule, but for the most part at the time, the Jewish fathers in these shtetls spent nearly every waking hour of theirs studying religious texts, and then working small little odd jobs when they absolutely had to, while Jewish mothers did all of the other household labor required to run a family. Here is a quote from Tamara Dutscher, who was raised in one of these turn-of-the-century shtetls. "All this pseudo-knowledge cluttered and strained my memory, took me away from real life, from real learning, from real knowledge of the world around me. It stunted my physical and mental development." Meanwhile, the children born into serfdom in these factories were essentially the exact opposite. The only common ground these two groups shared was poverty. The former serfs were almost all completely illiterate, but many of them had rather specialized trades, particularly when it came to agricultural labor. And they'd been exposed to leftist political ideas through word of mouth, especially the ideas of Mr. Karl Marx. Once these children combined secular ideas on one side and formal literacy on the other, and the worse conditions got in these factories, it was like a powder keg just waiting to ignite. Both sets of children had absolutely nothing to lose. Now, of course, workers' movements of all kinds were popping up all throughout Eastern Europe during this time. Not just Jewish movements. But again, Jews were an ethnic minority in this region, and unlike other groups, they were almost unanimous in their taking to leftist politics, making them wildly easy targets to make scapegoats out of. Boiling World War II down to a random mass execution erases the dozens of leftist movements that were popping up, who at that point had been fighting for what they believed would be a better world for nearly 6 decades at that point. This will be the next topic that I'm covering, as I do my first reread summarization of a book on here, of a book that was so influential to me that I began learning Yiddish myself, Revolutionary Yiddishland, A History of Jewish Radicalism. I won't lie, I'm very nervous to be covering this for two reasons. One, World War II is like every American history buff's favorite topic, and I actually hate learning about it because it's traumatic. And number two, Shmayanism. But don't worry, this book covers the path to Shmizrael extensively, and these French Jewish authors are extremely anti-imperialist. This book was written in 1983 when authors Alain Brassat and Sylvia Klingberg went around conducting interviews of the last remaining Jewish leftist militants they could find, all from the following branches of workers' movements. 1. Communists, 2. The Bund, and 3. Left Poal Zion. And if you made it this far, thank you for watching.